Whether you're starting your day with coffee or catching up on the road, today we're diving deep into what might be the most significant automotive policy shift Canada has seen in decades. On February 5th, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in an auto parts plant in Woodbridge, Ontario, and announced a complete overhaul of Canada's automotive strategy.
This is Auto Intelligence, and I'm here with my colleague to break down a strategy that's reshaping how Canada positions itself in the global automotive landscape. We're talking about $7.5 billion in direct spending, the repeal of the EV mandate, and some pretty bold bets on trade diversification that have everyone from Detroit to Beijing paying attention.
Auto Intelligence is produced by Auto Agentic, and new episodes drop every Tuesday. What struck me immediately about this announcement was both its scope and its timing. Canada's automotive sector supports over 500,000 workers, contributes more than $16 billion annually to GDP, and produced over 1.2 million passenger vehicles in 2025.
But here's the crisis context driving everything. Since April 2025, President Trump's 25% tariff on Canadian automobiles and parts has devastated an industry where over 90% of Canadian-made vehicles and 60% of Canadian-made parts are exported to the United States.
The human cost has been severe. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre noted in the House of Commons that job losses have hit Cami Ingersoll, GM Oshawa, Stellantis Brampton, and Packer Quebec. Thousands of Canadian auto workers have lost their positions as major manufacturers reduced operations.
And then there was this policy disconnect. The previous Trudeau government's electric vehicle availability standard required 20% of light-duty vehicle sales to be zero emission by 2026, rising to 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2035. But actual EV sales were sitting at only around 10%.
As Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association President Brian Kingston put it bluntly, we are currently sitting at 10% EV sales in Canada. Under the EV mandate, the industry had to get to 23% in the 2027 model year. That is over 200% growth in sales. The mandate was disconnected from reality.
So Carney framed this strategy as generational transformation, saying, Canada's new government is fundamentally transforming our economy from one reliant on a single trade partner to one that is stronger, more independent, and more resilient to global shocks. We are making strategic decisions and generational investments to build a strong Canadian auto sector, where Canadian workers build the cars of the future.
The strategy has 5 pillars, and the financial commitment is substantial. Let me break down where that $7.5 billion is actually going. $3 billion from the Strategic Response Fund for manufacturing support, $100 million from the Regional Tariff Response Initiative, $2.3 billion for the EV Affordability Program, $1.5 billion for EV charging network through the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and $570 million for workforce reskilling and employment assistance.
But that's just the direct spending. The broader fiscal impact includes the Productivity Super-Deduction, reduced corporate tax rates, expanded tax incentive programs. The super-deduction is significant. It reduces Canada's marginal effective tax rate on investment to 13%, more than 4 percentage points lower than the United States.
As Carney explained, it means businesses can immediately expense 100% of their investments in manufacturing machinery, in equipment, in buildings, in zero-emission vehicles, in clean energy equipment, in scientific research and development, and productivity-enhancing assets, including patents, data network infrastructure, computers, and beyond.
The second pillar is the politically explosive one, repealing the electric vehicle availability standard and replacing it with greenhouse gas emission standards, targeting a 57% reduction in carbon pollution from vehicles. The key difference is technology neutrality.
Industry Minister Melanie Joly described it as moving from a mandatory hard sales mandate to emission standards. Manufacturers can use any technology, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, high-efficiency internal combustion engines, to meet emission standards rather than being forced to sell fixed percentages of pure battery electric vehicles.
The government claims these standards will put Canada on a path to achieve 75% EV sales by 2035 and 90% by 2040. But here's the problem. When CBC News asked for detailed modelling supporting that 57% reduction claim, federal officials admitted that modelling was still being developed and wouldn't be finalised until later in 2026.
That's a significant gap between announcement and technical substance. The Transition Accelerator flagged this risk directly. If your goal is to reduce 90% of fleet emissions, it's clear that EVs are the path forward. But if your goal is 30% reduction in the near term, you can get there with regular hybrids.
The third pillar addresses what Kingston called not a supply issue in Canada for electric vehicles. We have a demand problem. The 5-year, $2.3 billion EV affordability program provides up to $5,000 for battery electric and fuel cell vehicles, $2,500 for plug-in hybrids.
But there's this deliberate structure that advantages Canadian-made vehicles. Foreign-made EVs face a $50,000 transaction value cap for rebates. But as Carney stated, to support the Canadian auto industry, this $50,000 cap will not apply to Canadian-made EVs and plug-in hybrids.
Here's a practical problem, though. Critical Minerals Institute Director Peter Clausey pointed out there are currently only 2 hybrid models for sale in Canada under $50,000. If the incentive program is designed to move the market, but eligible vehicles aren't available at accessible price points, the program's impact could be limited.
You're listening to Auto Intelligence, produced by Auto Agentic. Auto Agentic is building the intelligence foundation for the automotive industry. While most platforms optimize individual tasks, Auto Agentic coordinates organizations through specialized automotive agents operating across dealerships, dealer groups, and OEM environments.
This Canadian strategy is exactly the kind of complex, multi-stakeholder coordination challenge that requires intelligence architecture. You've got trade policy, manufacturing incentives, consumer behaviour, provincial alignment, infrastructure development, and workforce transitions that must operate as a coordinated system, not isolated initiatives.
From 2024 to 2025, the industry built foundations. 2026 is the year pilots become playbooks. What we're seeing with this strategy is how automotive intelligence needs to operate at the ecosystem level, coordinating across policies, stakeholders, and timelines simultaneously.
Now, the fourth pillar gets really complex. The Automotive Duty Remission Framework through a tradable credit system. Companies that manufacture vehicles in Canada earn credits that can be traded to other companies for duty-free imports.
This approach is historically proven. It's how Toyota and Honda came to Canada originally. And now those 2 Japanese companies represent a stunning concentration of Canadian production. Toyota and Honda produce 77% of all vehicles assembled in Canada in 2025, up from just 44% a decade earlier.
Industry Minister Joly explicitly acknowledged this benefit. It is a way actually to compensate companies such as Honda and Toyota that are increasing their production in Canada. It's another way for them to make revenues. But the consultation process starting this spring still needs to define critical parameters.
What counts as investment? Just final assembly or battery cell manufacturing, critical minerals processing, software development? How are credits valued and traded? What production thresholds trigger eligibility? The government has already shown this is performance-based. GM's tariff-free import quota was reduced by 24.2% and Stellantis's by 50% after production cuts.
The trade diversification component is strategically ambitious. Canada maintains retaliatory tariffs on US auto imports while leveraging recent diplomatic efforts, including a strategic partnership with China, allowing exactly 49,000 Chinese EV imports annually, plus a memorandum of understanding with South Korea.
That China agreement is fascinating in its specifics. Up to 49,000 Chinese EVs annually at 6.1% tariff, down from the punitive 100% surtax. But within 5 years, more than 50% of these vehicles must be affordable EVs with import prices under $35,000.
And here's the strategic play. Imported Chinese EVs within the quota won't qualify for federal purchase incentives unless they're manufactured in Canada. Minister Joly revealed Canada is in active conversations to establish Chinese-Canadian joint venture assembly plants with potential partners, including Magna International, Linamar, and Martin Rea International.
Joly told Bloomberg she met with BYD, the world's largest EV producer, and Sherry Automobile during a China trip. The government's expectation is ambitious. Within 3 years, this agreement will drive considerable new Chinese joint venture investment in Canada with trusted partners to protect and create new auto manufacturing careers for Canadian workers.
But this carries significant security implications. The US finalized rules in January 2025 prohibiting connected vehicles with Chinese hardware and software. Jolie says security concerns could be addressed through software solutions and labour standards, pointing to BlackBerry's QNX as a potential technology partner.
The fifth pillar commits $570 million in employment assistance for up to 66,000 workers, including displaced auto workers, work-sharing grants, workforce alliances, federal provincial auto task force coordination. The government claims early measures have created and protected 18,000 jobs and prevented more than 20,000 layoffs.
The industry response has been overwhelmingly positive across virtually every stakeholder group. Canadian Automobile Dealers Association President Tim Roos stated, "The announcement by Prime Minister Carney is a strong commitment by the government to the automotive industry and demonstrates their ability and willingness to respond to market realities and consumer demand."
Global automakers of Canada President David Adams welcomed the clarity but added a crucial caveat. We are pleased that the government has provided greater clarity. However, with all such announcements, the details matter. The consultation, timing, and ultimate implementation of the initiatives announced will be critical.
Automobile Parts Manufacturers Association President Flavio Volpe was direct. This government is doing a proper recalibration of mistakes that they made, and that's the sign of a mature government. New Car Dealers Association of BC President Blair Quayle called it a significant and positive course correction, adding, "Mandates don't sell vehicles, consumer demand does."
Canadian Charging Infrastructure Council President Travis Allen said, "Canada's new automotive package could unlock billions of dollars in charging investment if implemented fully. The government has listened to industry feedback that predictability and an orderly wind down for consumer incentives will help avoid market distortions."
But the unions were more cautious. Unifor National President Lana Payne welcomed the strategy but demanded follow-through. The bottom line for all automakers must be, if they want to sell in Canada, they have to build and invest in Canada. The free ride must end for companies that take from Canada's $100 billion sales market while giving nothing back.
Canadian Labour Congress President B. Bruce took a similar tone. "We recognize that Prime Minister Carney is speaking about ambition, but if we are going to get this right, it has to be built with workers and unions at the table so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past."
Provincial response has been mixed beyond Ontario. Premier Doug Ford, who initially criticised Carney's China EV deal, shifted to support after meeting with Carney and Minister Jolie. Ford called the auto strategy great, but reiterated his core demand. "If companies intend to enter our market, whether from China, Europe, or Asia, we have one request: manufacture the vehicles here."
But what about Quebec, which is mentioned as the largest Kia market globally? What about Alberta's position given oil and gas sector implications? British Columbia's existing EV policies? The Maritime Province's auto parts manufacturing? There's limited provincial coordination detail beyond Ontario.
The political criticism has been sharp and predictable. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre launched the most direct attack. The American president will continue to tariff Canadian-made automobiles going into the US, while Canadian taxpayers will be forced to subsidize American vehicles coming back into Canada.
Climate advocates raise serious concerns about retreating from environmental commitments. UBC climate scientist Simon Donner told CBC, "This policy is conceding far too much. The standard doesn't guarantee an increase in EV sales. It will depend on how they negotiate the standard."
Green Party leader Elizabeth May was blunt. "We are still lagging in climate action," and called Carney's climate commitments an absolute joke. Interim NDP leader Don Davies said he has eliminated the carbon tax, discarded EV targets, weakened environmental standards. "I find it hard to understand how anyone could label themselves a climate leader."
Environmental Defense had warned months earlier that backing away from the mandate would be short-sighted and leave our domestic auto industry dangerously exposed to shocks from American protectionism.
But here's the strategic context that makes this all incredibly high stakes: the approaching CUSMA review. This is the single most consequential variable for Canada's automotive future, and it's getting insufficient attention in the coverage.
The formal joint review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement must begin by July 1st, 2026. If parties can't agree on extending it for another 16 years, the agreement shifts from 6-year reviews to annual reviews, creating a decade of sustained uncertainty.
Trade lawyer John Boscariol warned, if we can't come to some agreement, we are going to review it the next year and the next year and the next year after that. He added bluntly, I do think it's a mistake to view this as a singular event. Companies expecting long-term certainty may be disappointed.
The U.S. is expected to push for higher regional value content thresholds beyond the current 75% minimum U.S.-specific content requirements and tariff rate quotas. CSIS analysts describe this as a painful extension scenario where Canada and Mexico are no longer treated as equal partners.
For Canada's auto industry, minimum US content requirements would force Canadian-assembled vehicles to incorporate more US-sourced parts, potentially undermining the economics of Ontario assembly plants that rely on integrated cross-border supply chains.
The worst-case scenario isn't review failure, but outright US withdrawal. Any party can invoke Article 34.6 and exit with just 6 months' notice. While constitutional constraints make this unlikely, it remains a latent threat.
Now, this is where the non-American automakers become strategically fascinating. The concentration of Canadian production in Japanese hands creates both opportunity and vulnerability. Toyota and Honda account for approximately 60% of assembly plant employment, but Toyota has publicly stated Trump's tariffs make Ontario manufacturing unsustainable.
Honda has begun shifting some production to circumvent tariffs. The auto strategy is, in many ways, a race to keep these two anchor companies while attracting new ones. Toyota has been assigned battery pack assembly for the 2026 RAV4 in Ontario, signaling deeper investment, not retreat.
Korean automakers present a different challenge. Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis hold approximately 12% of the Canadian market, but don't manufacture here. A Hyundai representative confirmed to CBC they have no intentions of establishing an automobile manufacturing facility in Canada, but are evaluating collaboration opportunities.
The Canada-Korea MOU signed in January 2026 is designed to change this calculus. Minister Joly revealed Quebec is the largest Kia market globally, and the government is definitely looking at car assembly plants. Our goal is to create jobs and attract investment.
European manufacturers occupy a unique position largely overlooked in coverage. Under CETA, European-made vehicles enter Canada tariff-free. As CD Howe Institute analyst Stephen Beattie explained, BMW vehicles imported from the United States will face tariffs, but BMW can still import cars tariff-free from Europe.
This means European automakers can redirect Canadian supply chains from U.S. to European assembly without tariff penalties. Clean Energy Canada recommends exploring a broader Canada-EU Auto Pact, signaling alignment on emission standards, opening Canada to more European EVs.
The structural shift underway is profound. Assembly plant employment has dropped from 32,700 in 2015 to approximately 23,700 by 2024, even before tariff-related layoffs. The Detroit Three have been reducing Canadian footprint for years.
GM shuttered Cami, Ingersoll, and Oshawa. Stellantis canceled Brampton production plans. Ford has limited Canadian operations. The result is a sector increasingly dependent on two Japanese companies, a strategic vulnerability if either significantly reduced operations.
But there's a critical gap in the strategy around critical minerals and battery supply chain integration. Canada has made $6.4 billion in G7 investment across 26 mining projects, but there's limited coordination with automotive manufacturing policy.
The Transition Accelerator flagged this. For this to work as industrial policy, investment needs to include the battery supply chain beyond just vehicle assembly. The Duty Remission Framework's consultation needs to define whether it rewards final assembly only or the entire EV value chain.
Canada has substantial battery ecosystem investments separately. The LG Stellantis plant in Windsor, offtake agreements with Rio Tinto and Northern Graphite, investments in rare earths and lithium-ion technology. The Canadian Climate Institute projects domestic critical minerals demand could reach $16 billion annually by 2040.
The implementation risks are significant. The technology-neutral emissions approach could allow manufacturers to meet interim targets through conventional hybrids rather than driving actual EV adoption. Ward's Auto analyst John Malinowski flagged that if Canadian and American standards diverge, OEMs will have to consider whether they make different models for the U.S. market than they do for the Canadian market.
For integrated North American production, model-specific divergence adds cost and complexity, potentially reducing Canada's attractiveness as a production base. The $50,000 price cap problem remains. Limited hybrid availability under that threshold questions the rebate program's market impact.
The tradable import credit system is innovative but completely undefined in crucial parameters. Who qualifies? How are credits valued? What production thresholds trigger eligibility? Will it account for Canadian value added in software and connected vehicle technology?
The CD Howe Institute's Stephen Beatty argued it should, noting a growing percentage of the value of a vehicle now comes from software and connected services. But those design details will determine whether the framework drives investment or just subsidizes imports.
There are missing dimensions around dealership network impact. Technology neutrality means dealers need capabilities for hybrids, plug-in hybrids, battery electrics, potentially hydrogen fuel cells. That's training, inventory management, and service infrastructure challenges not addressed.
Rural and northern community implications are absent. EV charging infrastructure works differently in urban southern Ontario versus northern Manitoba. How does the $1.5 billion charging investment address geographic realities and grid capacity constraints?
Indigenous communities are completely missing from the public strategy despite critical minerals often being on or near Indigenous territories. How are those communities consulted and participating economically in this value chain transformation?
Small and medium enterprise impact lacks detail. The strategy focuses on major manufacturers, but what about Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers? How do smaller companies access funding programs? What workforce transition support exists for smaller employers beyond the major union focus?
Environmental impact assessment is limited. This technology-neutral approach might reduce emissions 57%, but what's the life cycle analysis? Environmental impacts of increased mining, grid impacts of charging infrastructure, battery waste management for end-of-life disposal?
Cybersecurity frameworks are barely outlined beyond software solutions for Chinese vehicles. What's the actual security architecture? Data sovereignty protection? How do you balance market access with national security in connected vehicles?
Financial services implications aren't discussed. How do new incentives affect auto financing markets? Leasing structures, insurance frameworks for rapidly evolving technologies. These are significant market adaptations required.
Crisis management and contingency planning is absent. What if CUSMA negotiations fail completely? Chinese joint ventures don't materialize. US tariffs increase further. Alternative strategies for various disruption scenarios aren't outlined.
But here's what's strategically compelling about the overall direction. It recognizes Canada can't defend the status quo against forces reshaping global automotive. The build here to sell here doctrine returns to Auto Pact logic linking market access to domestic production.
Canadian Climate Institute economist Dave Sawyer offered balanced analysis. If you're really focused on significant emission reductions, you might not be thrilled. If you're from industry, you may grumble due to costs. However, it appears to be a balanced approach.
The timing creates compressed interdependencies. Consumer rebates, February 16th. Duty remission consultation spring 2026. GHG standards design summer 2026. CUSMA review July 1st. Detailed emissions modeling late 2026. Chinese joint ventures within 3 years.
Each milestone affects others. Poor CUSMA negotiations change investment calculus. Flexible emissions standards undermine environmental credibility. Generous duty remission could subsidize imports rather than production.
The Transition Accelerator identified 3 critical implementation challenges: regulatory design gaps, cross-strategy coordination needs, and the compressed timeline for delivering results. They concluded the next 6 to 12 months of regulatory design will be critical.
This creates a clear strategic hierarchy among non-American automakers. Toyota and Honda are strongest positioned as major producers, earning maximum credits. Chinese and Korean manufacturers actively courted for new plants, European manufacturers advantaged through CETA, Detroit 3 caught between competing pressures.
The fundamental bet is that diversification trumps integration, that multiple relationships are more resilient than single-partner dependency. As Critical Minerals Institute Director Peter Clossie said, Canada has its own policy. We are our own nation. This is an East-West policy decision, decreasing our reliance on one or two other countries.
But success depends entirely on details yet to come. The government announced framework, not finished policy. Industry leaders like global automakers David Adams emphasized the details matter. The consultation, timing, and ultimate implementation will be critical.
What we're seeing is Canada attempting to chart a third path between American protectionism and Asian competition, becoming a globally diversified production hub rather than a branch plant economy. Whether that's viable depends on regulatory design, negotiation outcomes, and investment decisions still unmade.
For our listeners in the automotive space, this strategy creates differentiated opportunities and risks depending on your value chain position. OEMs, suppliers, dealers, service providers, each faces distinct implications requiring careful analysis of the evolving policy details.
The regulatory consultation starting this spring will define who benefits and how. The CUSMA review beginning July 1st could reshape North American automotive fundamentally. Chinese joint venture discussions could introduce entirely new competitive dynamics.
Auto Agentic is building intelligence systems that coordinate across exactly these kinds of complex multi-stakeholder transformations. From 2027 onward, intelligence moves to ecosystem level. By 2030, agentic orchestration becomes standard for organizations navigating these interdependent challenges.
The automotive industry faces simultaneous technological transformation, trade uncertainty, and geopolitical realignment. How organizations coordinate their response across all these dimensions, that's the defining capability of the next decade.
This episode was produced by the team at Auto Agentic. Learn more at autoagentic.ai. Special thanks to Barry Hillier, founder and CEO of Auto Agentic and producer of Auto Intelligence, for his insights on coordinating complex industrial policy implementation.
If you've got thoughts on Canada's automotive strategy, stories from your operations about trade disruption impacts, or insights on the missing implementation dimensions we've discussed, send them to Barry at autoagentic.ai.
The future belongs to organizations that can orchestrate complexity across policies, technologies, and stakeholders simultaneously. Canada's automotive strategy is attempting exactly that coordination. Whether it succeeds depends on execution details that are still being designed.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next Tuesday with more automotive intelligence. The transformation is accelerating, and coordination capability will separate the winners from the casualties.